Get on the floor. Every single one of you. Now. The man's voice cracked through the quiet restaurant like a bone snapping in the dark. He was tall, wiry, wearing a black mask pulled tight across the bridge of his nose. Behind him, two more figures poured through the shattered glass door, one clutching a sawed-off shotgun, the other gripping a rusted handgun with shaking fingers. Before the story goes any further, pause for just 1 second. If you love stories that pull you in slowly, stories where power hides behind silence, where one decision changes everything, and where the truth is never what it seems, then this channel was made for you. Hit the subscribe button now. Let's continue. The kind of fingers that belong to a man desperate enough to pull a trigger without thinking. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night in Itaewon, Seoul. The kind of night that smelled like old rain and fried garlic. The kind that should have ended with nothing more than cold tea and tired feet. But not tonight. The restaurant was called Gukbo. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A narrow storefront wedge between a nail salon and a phone repair shop. Faded awning. Chipped wooden sign. The kind of place a tourist would walk past without a second glance. But in certain circles, in certain whispers traded between men who moved money and blood through the veins of Seoul's underground, everyone knew the truth. Gukbo belonged to Kang Seonjin. And Kang Seonjin was not a man who tolerated disruptions. He was sitting in the far corner booth, the one with the cracked leather seat and the small window that overlooked the alley. His back was against the wall because that is where men like him always sat. A half-finished bowl of doenjang sat cooling in front of him. A cigarette burned between his fingers, unsmoked, the ash growing long and gray like a question he refused to answer. He was 43 years old. His hair was cut short, almost military, threaded with silver at the temples. His face was the kind of face that had once been handsome before the years carved it into something harder. Something that made people look away not out of disgust, but out of instinct. The way animals sense a predator even when it is perfectly still. Two of his men sat at the bar. They had seen the robbers come in. Their hands had already moved beneath their jackets. But Seonjin had lifted one finger from the table. Just one. And they had frozen. He wanted to watch. There were only 6 other people in the restaurant at this hour. An elderly couple near the door who had been sharing a plate of japchae. A young man in a wrinkled suit who looked like he had just been fired or dumped or both. A woman with red-rimmed eyes sitting alone with a glass of soju she had not touched. And 2 waitresses, one behind the counter and one standing in the middle of the floor holding a tray of empty dishes, caught between the robbers and the rest of the room like a deer frozen in headlights that would not dim. I said get down, the lead robber shouted again. And this time he swung the shotgun toward the elderly couple. The old woman let out a sound, not quite a scream, more like the air being pressed from her lungs by fear itself. Seonjin watched. His expression did not change. He brought the cigarette to his lips, took a slow drag, and exhaled through his nose. Smoke curled around him like a second skin. He had seen worse. He had done worse. The robber with the handgun moved toward the register. The third man, the one without a visible weapon, grabbed the young businessman by the collar and threw him to the floor. His glasses skittered across the tiles. Wallets, phones, jewelry, everything on the floor in front of you. You have 30 seconds. Seonjin's men at the bar were coiled tight. He could feel their tension from across the room, like heat radiating off asphalt. They were waiting for his signal. One word from him, and this would end in 3 seconds and 3 bodies. But Seonjin did not give the word. Not yet. Because something about this felt orchestrated. Sloppy, yes. Amateurish, absolutely. But the timing, the location, the fact that someone had chosen his restaurant on a night when he happened to be eating here, that tickled something at the base of his skull. The instinct that had kept him alive for 20 years in an industry that buried men weekly. So he watched. He waited. He let the scene breathe. The waitress behind the counter, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Yoon, had already dropped to her knees, her hands over her head. She had worked here for 6 years. She knew who owned this restaurant. She knew that whatever was happening would be handled. Her faith in Seonjin's machinery was absolute. But the other waitress, the one in the middle of the floor, she was new. Seonjin had barely noticed her before tonight. She had started 3 weeks ago. Quiet. Small. The kind of woman who moved through a room like she was trying not to leave footprints. She kept her hair pulled back tight. Wore no makeup. Kept her eyes on the floor when she took orders, as if eye contact was something that cost her. He had assumed she was just another college student picking up shifts to survive the city. Soul chewed through young people like that. He had not given her a second thought. Until now. She was standing completely still, the tray of dishes trembling in her hands, her eyes wide, but not with the kind of fear he expected. It was something else. Something deeper. The look of a person who had been in danger before and recognized it the way you recognize an old wound when the weather changes. The lead robber turned to her. You. Put that down and get on the ground. She did not move. Hey, are you deaf? Her lips parted. Her chest rose and fell once, twice. And then she spoke. Please, she said. Please stop this. There are old people here. There is no need for this. Please. I am begging you. Don't do this. Halmiani and Harabiaji are scared. Please, for the sake of, please, Iyama would not want this. And then, almost inaudibly, almost swallowed by the tremor in her own throat, she whispered a name. Myria. If you had been watching Kang Seonjin's face in that moment, you would have seen something extraordinary. Not because his expression changed dramatically, but because it changed at all. The cigarette between his fingers went still. The ash that had been building finally fell, scattering across the dark fabric of his trousers like gray snow. His jaw tightened, not in anger, in recognition. His pupils contracted as if the light in the room had suddenly doubled. He knew that accent, not the standard Seoul dialect that most people in this city wore like a uniform. Hers carried the lilt of Tongyeong, a coastal city in the south where the vowels stretched like fishing nets drying in the wind, and certain words curled upward at the end as if they were afraid of landing. He had not heard that accent in almost 20 years. And the name, Myri, spoken exactly that way, with the slight break between syllables, the way someone speaks a name they have been carrying like a stone in their chest for years. That name had been erased, burned from documents, scrubbed from phone records, eliminated from every database and ledger and whispered conversation in the Kong organization's network. He had made sure of it personally. Myri was not a name that existed anymore. It was not supposed to exist. And yet here it was, falling from the lips of a waitress who should have been nobody. His hand moved to the edge of the table, not toward a weapon, toward stability. Because for the first time in years, Kang Seonjin felt something shift beneath him, something foundational, something that had nothing to do with the three amateurs waving guns in his restaurant and everything to do with a night 20 years ago when the rain tasted like salt and a woman's screams were swallowed by the sea. He leaned forward, just slightly, his eyes locked onto the waitress with an intensity that could have burned through steel. Who are you, he thought. Who are you, and how do you know that name? The robber grabbed her arm and threw her to the ground. The tray crashed. Dishes shattered. She hit the tile hard on her side and let out a gasp, not of pain, but of the kind of surprise that comes when the world reminds you that it has never stopped being cruel. And something in Seonjin moved. Not a decision. Not yet. Something older than a decision. Something that lived in the part of him he had spent 2 decades trying to kill. He stood up. His men at the bar saw him rise, and their hands found their weapons. The room seemed to compress, as if the walls had taken a breath and were holding it. The lead robber turned toward him and saw a man in a dark coat standing in the corner booth with eyes that held nothing warm and nothing cold. Only the absolute stillness of someone who had decided that the next 30 seconds would determine whether people lived or died. Sit down, old man, the robber said. Seonjin did not sit down. He looked past the robber, past the shotgun, past all of it. He looked at the waitress on the floor, her hair coming loose from its tie, her cheek pressed against the cold tile, her eyes finding his for the first time. And in her eyes, he saw it. The shape of her mother's face. The exact angle of her brow. The same darkness in the iris that had once looked at him across a hospital room in Tongyeong and said, "Promise me you will protect her. No matter what happens to me. Promise me, Seonjin." His blood turned to ice and fire simultaneously. The waitress was not just tied to the name Myri. She was Myri's daughter, which meant she was the daughter of the woman he had loved before the empire, before the blood, before the throne of shadows he had built over her grave. And if anyone in this room, anyone in this city, anyone in the web of alliances and enemies that made up his world discovered who this girl was, it would not just expose a secret. It would unravel everything. If you are already hooked and you want to know what happens next, go ahead and subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment telling me what you think Seonjin is going to do. Will he reveal himself? Will he let her go? You have no idea what is coming. P. The restaurant existed in a kind of suspended silence. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The faint buzz of the fluorescent light above the register. The wet, panicked breathing of the elderly woman by the door. And underneath all of it, the sound of Seonjin's heartbeat in his own ears, steady as a clock counting down to something irreversible. He had not felt this in years. The sensation of standing at the edge of two choices, both of which led to ruin. The lead robber was staring at him. The shotgun was pointed loosely in his direction, not aimed with precision, but held with the careless confidence of a man who believed the weapon itself was enough. Seonjin had seen that posture 100 times. It was the posture of someone who had never been in a room with a person who knew how to take a gun away and use it in the same motion. I said sit down, the robber repeated. Seonjin's voice came out low and even, the way a river sounds when it is deep enough to drown in. You chose the wrong restaurant. It was not a threat. It was an observation. The way a doctor might tell a patient that the diagnosis was terminal. No malice. No drama. Just fact. The robber hesitated. Something in Seonjin's tone scratched against the surface of his bravado and found the fear underneath. Then Seonjin tilted his head, just slightly, toward the bar, and his two men moved. What happened next took 4 seconds. The first man, Park Juno, covered the distance to the robber with the handgun in 2 strides and broke his wrist with a single downward strike. The gun clattered to the floor. The second man, Do Hyun, came off the bar stool like a coiled spring and caught the third robber with a knee to the sternum that folded him in half. The lead robber swung the shotgun toward Juno, but Seonjin was already moving. He crossed the room with a speed that contradicted his age and his stillness, and his hand closed over the barrel of the shotgun and pushed it toward the ceiling just as the trigger was pulled. The blast punched a hole in the plaster above them, raining down white dust like artificial snow. Seonjin twisted the gun free with a motion that was less technique and more memory, the muscle recall of a young man who had grown up in rooms exactly like this one, rooms where hesitation was a luxury the dead had not been able to afford. He held the shotgun loosely at his side. The robber stumbled backward, his mask pulled crooked, one eye visible and wide with a terror that had arrived far too late to save him. On your knees, Seonjin said. The 3 robbers were on the floor within 10 seconds. Juno zip-tied their wrists with the efficiency of someone who had done this so many times it no longer required thought. Do Hyun was already on the phone, speaking in low, coded Korean to whoever handled cleanups at this hour. The elderly couple was helped to their feet. The businessman retrieved his glasses with shaking hands. Mrs. Yoon rose from behind the counter and immediately began sweeping broken dishes, because that was how she processed fear, through motion, through routine, through the stubborn insistence that the world could be put back in order one fragment at a time. But Seonjin was not looking at any of them. He was looking at the girl on the floor. She had not moved. She was lying on her side, her arms wrapped around herself, her hair covering half her face. She was trembling, but not violently. It was the low, constant vibration of someone whose body had learned to be afraid a long time ago and had never fully forgotten how. He crouched down beside her. Slowly, the way you approach something fragile that you are not sure you have the right to touch. Are you hurt? He asked. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but the tears had not fallen. She was holding them back with a kind of ferocity that made his chest ache because he recognized it. He had seen it before, in another pair of eyes, in another lifetime. I am fine, she whispered. Thank you. He studied her face. Up close, the resemblance was even more devastating. The same. High cheekbones. The same small scar near the left ear, though hers might have come from something different. The same way her lower lip pressed upwards slightly when she was trying to keep her composure, as if the act of holding herself together was a physical labor. What is your name? He asked. She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But he caught it. He caught everything. Yoon Sarah, she said. A fake name. He was certain of it instantly. Not because of anything she did wrong, but because of the way it sat in her mouth, like a coat that did not quite fit, worn out of necessity rather than belonging. Sarah, he repeated, tasting the lie. How long have you worked here? 3 weeks. Where are you from? Another hesitation. Longer this time. Busan, she said. But her accent was not Busan. Her accent was Tonggyong, and the name she had whispered, Myri, was not a name anyone from Busan would carry with that particular weight of grief. He stood up. He extended his hand to help her to her feet. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. Her fingers were cold and thin, and when they touched his palm, he felt something go through him that was not electricity and not memory, but something in between, something that lived in the space where the body stores the things the mind has tried to forget. She stood. She smoothed her apron. She looked at the broken dishes on the floor and immediately bent to pick them up, and he saw it again. That same instinct Mrs. Yoon had, the instinct to clean, to fix, to make the mess disappear, because the mess was easier to face than the cause of it. "Leave it," he said. "It is my job. Leave it. Go to the back. Sit down. Drink some water." She looked at him. For the first time, really looked at him. And something passed across her face, a shadow of recognition that was gone before it fully formed. She did not know who he was. But some part of her, some cellular, inherited, bone-deep part of her, responded to him in a way that she clearly did not understand. She went to the back. Seonjin watched her disappear through the kitchen door. Then he turned to Juno, who was standing over the zip-tied robbers with the patient boredom of a man waiting for a bus. "Find out who sent them," Seonjin said. "Tonight. Boss, they look independent. Just street level. Nobody robs my restaurant by accident. Find out." Juno nodded. Seonjin lit another cigarette. His hands were steady. They were always steady. But inside, in the architecture of himself that no one was permitted to see, walls were cracking. Myri. He had not spoken that name aloud in 18 years. He had not allowed anyone to speak it. It had been removed from the organization's history the way a surgeon removes a tumor, completely, precisely, and with the understanding that leaving even a single cell behind could be fatal. Myri had been a woman from Tonggyong, a fisherman's daughter. She had hair that smelled like the sea even when she was nowhere near it. And she laughed in a way that made him forget, briefly, that he was a man whose hands were stained with things that laughter should not be able to wash away. He had met her when he was 23, before the Kong name meant anything, before the empire, before the iron laws and the blood oaths and the network that now stretched from Seoul to Busan to Osaka, to cities whose names he only knew because his money passed through them. She had loved him when he was nothing, and he had loved her with the reckless, stupid, annihilating love of a young man who did not yet understand that the world punishes that kind of love with surgical precision. They had a year together. 1 year. 12 months that he had lived inside the way a man lives inside a warm house during a storm, knowing the storm is still there, knowing the walls will not hold forever, but choosing, for those 12 months, to believe they might. Then the war came. The Kong family's rise to power was not a gentle ascent. It was a war fought in alleys and boardrooms and the back seats of cars that smelled like leather and copper. His father, Kong Daeho, had been killed by a rival faction, the Johns, and the young Seonjin had been forced to choose between the life he wanted and the throne he had inherited. He chose the throne. He always knew he would. It was not a choice made with joy. It was made with the grim acceptance of a man stepping into a river he knows is too strong to swim against, deciding instead to become the current itself. But Myri was pregnant. He had found out 3 days after his father's funeral, standing in a hospital room in Tonggyong with blood still under his fingernails that did not belong to him. She had told him with a calm that terrified him, because he knew that calm was not peace. It was preparation. She already knew what was coming. "You cannot keep us," she had said. Not an accusation. A fact. "I will protect you," he had answered. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me you will protect her, no matter what happens to me. Promise me, Seonjin." He had promised. And then he had broken that promise so completely that the shards of it had been cutting him from the inside ever since. The Johns had discovered Myri. They used her as leverage. Seonjin had been given a choice: surrender the Kong territories in Tonggyong or watch her die. He had tried to negotiate. He had tried to plan. He had tried to be the strategic, calculating leader his father's ghost demanded. And while he was trying, she disappeared. He was told she was dead. His own people told him. His lieutenant at the time, a man named Hwang Chulsu, had delivered the news with the appropriate gravity and the appropriate evidence: a photograph, a police report, a closed casket that he was advised not to open. He had not opened it. He had taken that grief and compressed it into something dense and black and used it as fuel. He burned the Johns to the ground. He dismantled their network city by city, life by life, until the name John was spoken only in past tense. And then he built his empire on top of the ashes, and he told himself that the man who had loved Myri was buried in those ashes too. But now a girl with Myri's face and Myri's accent was washing dishes in the back of his restaurant, and she had whispered a dead woman's name as if it was the only prayer she knew. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had not called in years. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. Older now, rougher, but unmistakable. Hwang Chulsu, Seonjin said. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, boss. It has been a long time. You told me she was dead. A longer silence. The kind that has weight. The kind that presses against the earpiece like a hand trying to keep the words from escaping. Boss, I do not understand what you are. Do not lie to me. Not tonight. You told me Myri was dead. You showed me a photograph. You showed me a report. Was it real? The silence stretched until it became an answer all by itself. Chulsu. She made me promise. Chulsu whispered. She said if you knew she was alive, you would come for her. And if you came for her, the Johns would follow you. She said the only way to protect the baby was to make sure you never looked. She begged me, Seonjin. She was bleeding and she was holding that baby, and she begged me. Seonjin closed his eyes. The restaurant hummed around him. Before the story goes any further, pause for just 1 second. If you love stories that pull you in slowly, stories where power hides behind silence, where one decision changes everything, and where the truth is never what it seems, then this channel was made for you. The robbers groaned on the floor. Juno and Do-hyun exchanged glances, sensing that something was shifting in their boss, something seismic, something that their training had not prepared them for because it had nothing to do with territory or money or power. Where is Myri now? Seonjin asked. Another pause. Longer. Heavier. She died, Chulsa said. For real. 7 years ago. Cancer. She was in Tongyeong the whole time. She never left. She raised the girl alone. She never told the girl anything about you. Nothing. The girl does not know who her father is. Seonjin opened his eyes. Through the kitchen door, he could see the faintest movement. Sarah, or whatever her real name was, sitting on a stool by the sink, her head bowed, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked so small, so impossibly small against the stainless steel and fluorescent light of that kitchen. His daughter. The word hit him like a bullet he had been outrunning for 18 years. Boss, Chulsa said carefully. If the organization finds out you have a daughter, every enemy you have ever made will use her. You know this. Myri knew this. That is why she did what she did. Seonjin said nothing. Let her go, Chulsa said. Let her live her life. She does not know. She does not need to know. You can protect her from a distance. You have the resources. But if you pull her into your world, she is already in my world, Seonjin said quietly. She is working in my restaurant, Chulsu. She came to me. She found her way here without knowing what she was finding. What does that tell you? It tells me you need to be very, very careful about what you do next. Seonjin hung up. He stood in his corner of the restaurant, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, holding a phone that suddenly felt like the heaviest object in the world. And he understood, with the clarity that only comes when the universe corners you and forces you to see, that the robbery tonight was not the crisis. The crisis was the girl in the kitchen. The crisis was the fact that his most dangerous secret was now sitting 15 feet away from him, breathing, alive, real, and utterly unaware that the man who had just saved her life was the same man who had abandoned her before she was born. And somewhere in the shadows of Seoul's underworld, someone had sent 3 men to rob this specific restaurant on this specific night. Someone who might already know what Seonjin had just discovered. Someone who was watching. Now before we continue, I need you to do something. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Tell me, do you think someone set this whole thing up? Do you think those robbers were really random? Let me know what you think, because part 3 is going to change everything. Part 3, The Reckoning. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Seonjin did not sleep more than 2 hours in any stretch, in which he moved through the rituals of his empire, the meetings, the calls, the quiet adjudications of disputes that lesser men could not resolve, with the mechanical precision of a man whose body knew the choreography even when his mind was somewhere else entirely. His mind was in the kitchen of Gukbo, watching a girl sit on a stool with her hands in her lap. He had Juno run a quiet investigation. No records, no digital trail, nothing that could be traced. Old school work. Footsteps on pavement. Questions asked in person to people who knew how to forget they had been asked. The results came back piece by piece, like fragments of a photograph being assembled in the dark. Her real name was Shin Mairi, not Yunsera. She had taken her mother's surname, Shin, and she carried her mother's given name as her own, because when Shin Mairi the elder had died 7 years ago in a hospice in Tongyeong, the daughter had taken the name as an act of devotion so fierce it bordered on self-erasure. She had become her mother's name, her mother's ghost, her mother's continuation in a world that had taken everything else. She was 20 years old. She had graduated from a local high school in Tongyeong with marks that should have sent her to a university, but could not, because there was no money. Her mother's medical bills had consumed everything. The small house by the harbor had been sold to pay debts. She had worked in fish markets, convenience stores, a laundromat that paid her under the table. And 6 months ago, she had come to Seoul with nothing but a duffel bag and a name she had heard her mother whisper in the final days. A name spoken through the haze of morphine and regret. Kang Seonjin. She did not know he was her father. Her mother had never told her that. What her mother had told her, in those last morphine-laced hours, was that Kang Seonjin was a man who owed them a debt. A man who had made a promise. A man who could be found in Seoul, if she ever needed help, if the world ever became too heavy to carry alone. She had come to Seoul to find him, not out of love, not out of longing, out of survival. She was drowning, and her dying mother had given her the name of a life raft. And by some accident of fate, or perhaps by the kind of design that the universe employs when it is tired of waiting for humans to correct their own mistakes, she had applied for a job at a restaurant owned by the very man she was looking for, without knowing he owned it, without knowing she had already found what she was searching for. Seonjin read Juno's report sitting in his office above a nightclub in Gangnam. The office was spare. A desk, a chair, a window that overlooked the city like a confession booth that faced the wrong direction. He read the report twice. Then he set it down and pressed his fingers to his eyes until he saw colors that did not exist. 20 years. She had been alive for 20 years, and he had not known. She had grown up without a father, in a coastal city that smelled like salt and diesel, raised by a woman who loved him enough to let him believe she was dead so that he would not destroy them both by trying to save them. And now Mairi, the daughter, was in his city, in his restaurant, in the orbit of his power, which meant in the orbit of his danger. The question was no longer whether to act. The question was how. Because Juno's investigation had uncovered something else. Something that turned the situation from a personal crisis into an existential one. The robbery at Gukbo had not been random. The 3 men were hired. Low-level thugs contracted through a broker in Yongsan. The money had been routed through 4 accounts, but Juno had traced it to its source, a shell company linked to a name that made Seonjin's blood cool by several degrees. John Tasik. The Johns were supposed to be finished. Seonjin had dismantled them 2 decades ago. He had been thorough. He had been merciless. But John Tasik was the youngest son of the old patriarch, a boy who had been 12 years old when his family's empire fell. A boy who had been overlooked because he was a child. A boy who was now 32 and had apparently spent the last 20 years doing what Seonjin himself had done after his father's death, building, waiting, sharpening himself into a weapon aimed at the man who had taken everything from him. And John Tasik knew about the girl. How he knew, Seonjin could not yet determine. Perhaps Chulsa had talked. Perhaps someone in Tongyeong had remembered. Perhaps the past simply refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave. But Tasik knew. And the robbery had been a test. Not an attempt to rob. An attempt to see how Seonjin would react. Would he protect a random waitress? Would he reveal, through action or hesitation, that she meant something? Would the great Kang Seonjin show a crack in his armor that could be exploited? Seonjin had passed the test. Or failed it, depending on perspective. He had neutralized the robbers efficiently, as any boss would when his property was threatened. But Juno believed they had been watched. A car parked across the street with tinted windows. A drone complaint filed by a neighbor that same night. Someone had been recording, which meant someone was building a case. Not a legal case. An operational one. A map of Seonjin's weaknesses. And at the center of that map, like a pin pushed into the heart of everything, was a 20-year-old waitress named Min-jae who had no idea that her existence was a weapon aimed at the most powerful man in Seoul's underworld. On the fourth night, Seonjin went back to Gukbo. He arrived late. 11 o'clock. The restaurant was quiet. Mrs. Yoon was wiping down tables. Two regulars sat at the bar nursing bottles of soju. And Myri, his daughter, his secret, his wound, was refilling the banchan containers in the kitchen, her movements careful and precise, the movements of a person who had learned that carelessness was a luxury she could not afford. He sat in his usual booth. He ordered doenjang jjigae. He waited. She brought it to his table. She set it down with both hands, the way her mother used to set things down, with a slight bow of the head that was not quite formal and not quite casual, but existed in the space between respect and self-protection. "Thank you," he said. "Of course." She turned to leave. "Sarah." She stopped. She turned back. He watched her face for the flicker, the tiny flinch that came with hearing a name that was not really hers. It was there. Barely. But there. "How are you? After the other night?" "I am fine. Thank you for what you did." "Sit down." It was not a request. But it was not a command either. It occupied a space that only men like Seonjin knew how to create. The space where authority and invitation become indistinguishable. She hesitated. Then she sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on the surface of the wood, tracing the grain as if it held instructions. "You are from Tongyeong," he said. Her eyes lifted. Sharp. Guarded. "I said Busan." "You said Busan. But your accent says Tongyeong. The way you pronounce certain words. The way you said Halmeani the other night, with the vowel stretched. That is coastal Gyeongsang. Specifically Tongyeong." She stared at him. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The rapid assessment of threat and opportunity that people who have lived hard lives perform unconsciously, the way the rest of us breathe. "Why does it matter where I am from?" she asked. "Because I think you came to Seoul looking for someone." Silence. "And I think you ended up here not entirely by accident." More silence. But it was different now. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump or step back. "How would you know that?" she whispered. "Because I know things about you that you have not told me. And I know things about your mother." Her composure broke. Not dramatically. Not with tears or shouting. It broke the way ice breaks on a lake in spring, a single crack that runs the length of the surface, revealing the dark water underneath. "You knew my mother?" Her voice was barely audible. "Yes." "How?" He looked at her mother's face worn by a different life, at the eyes that held the same stubborn refusal to be destroyed that had made him fall in love 21 years ago. "Your mother's name was Min-jae. She grew up on the harbor in Tongyeong. She worked at her father's fish stall before she went to nursing school. She had a scar on her right hand from a fishing hook when she was 9. And she used to sing a song when she was nervous, an old song, something about the tides and the moon. She never remembered all the words, so she hummed the parts she forgot." Myri's eyes filled. The tears she had held back 4 nights ago finally fell, not in a rush, but slowly, one by one, like they had been waiting in line for years. "Who are you?" she breathed. And here it was. The moment. The edge. The place where the man he had become and the man he had been stood face to face. Across a divide of blood and time and cowardice and love. He could lie. He could tell her he was a friend of her mother's. A colleague. A distant relation. He could protect his empire, maintain his armor, keep the secret sealed in its grave. Or he could tell her the truth and watch everything he had built begin to tremble. He thought of Myri, her mother, bleeding in that hospital room, holding a baby she had not yet named, saying, "Promise me, Seonjin." He thought of the promise he had broken. He thought of John Tasik, watching from the shadows, waiting for exactly this kind of vulnerability. And he thought of something his father had told him once, long before the empire, long before the blood. His father had said, "The strongest wall a man can build is not made of stone or steel. It is made of the things he is willing to lose." Seonjin had built his wall out of everything he was not willing to lose. Out of money, out of power, out of fear. And it had held for 20 years. But it had also kept out everything worth having. "My name," he said, and his voice, for the first time in as long as he could remember, was not the voice of a boss or a strategist or a king of shadows. It was the voice of a man standing at the bottom of a well he had dug himself, looking up at a circle of light he was not sure he deserved. My name is Kang Seonjin, and I am your father. She stared at him. The tears stopped. Not because the emotion stopped, but because her body seemed to enter a state beyond tears, a state where feeling becomes so large that the usual outlets cannot contain it. No, she said. Yes. No. My mother said. She said you owed us. She said you were someone who could help. She never said. She protected you. From me. From my world. She let me believe she was dead so that I would never lead my enemies to you. She sacrificed everything, including the possibility that you would ever know your father, to keep you safe. Myri stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. She was shaking, not with the tremor of the robbery night, but with something deeper, the vibration of a foundation being rewritten. If you are my father, she said, and her voice was steady now with the kind of steel that he recognized because it was his own. Then where were you? Where were you when she was dying? Where were you when I was 14 and working in a fish market at 4 in the morning because there was no one else? Where were you when I ate rice with salt for dinner because there was nothing else in the house? Each question landed like a fist against his chest. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He sat in the booth and absorbed every blow because they were get on the floor.